And we are ready to go. Thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin Utting, everyone, Smithsonian Institute Human Origins Department. Take it away, Benjamin. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for your kind introduction. Yeah, so again, my name is Ben Utting, and I'll be talking a little bit about my research in Southeast Asia, particularly some of the archaeology of Raja Ampat, which is near New Guinea, and a little bit about my research in Vietnam. Um, yeah, so I think, how do I proceed? I click it. Okay. So before we get into it, just go over the presentation structure, a little bit of a roadmap, discuss a little bit about me, my background, talking about the background of some of this research, kind of where it situates itself in our anthropology and archaeology. I'll talk a little bit about the research I've conducted and the research I'm currently conducting right now, and then move on to focus a little bit about the Raja Ampat project, including a discussion of the fieldwork that was undertaken this past summer between June and September, a little bit about our excavation, as well as archaeological survey of the northern island, or the northern coast of an island, and some museum collections research with a local university, and a little bit about what we're aiming to do moving forward with the project. And I will note throughout this presentation, you'll see these wonderful photos. I know where I am, it's about 23 degrees, so we can mentally transport ourselves to a tropical beach somewhere in Indonesia, maybe escape the cold a little bit. So a little bit about me. I think, yeah, so my bachelor's in anthropology from Stony Brook University up in New York, Long Island. Then I moved over to the United Kingdom to do my master's and doctorate in archaeology at the University of Cambridge. And I'm currently a Peter Buck and Life on a Sustainable Planet postdoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, where my main research focus is called the AC project, AC standing for the Archaeology of Environmental Adaptation in Southeast Asia. Some of my broader research interests include the Pleistocene hunter-gatherer archaeology and ecology, lithic analysis, which is saying I study stone tools. I'm broadly interested in Southeast Asia as a region. Also archaeological science, so deploying scientific methods, scientific frameworks for the analysis of the archaeological record, as well as quantitative analyses. So looking at different ways of interpreting data, how we learn from numbers, broadly speaking. I won't talk too much about math today, so don't have to worry about that. The AC project, just a broad overview of the archaeology of environmental adaptation in Southeast Asia. Climate environment, we're broadly interested in studying climate environment and human behavior in Southeast Asia over the past 60,000 years, which sounds like a pretty broad task, and it kind of is. The broad research topics include human adaptation. So how do the humans who enter Southeast Asia and occupy this region adapt to these novel environments, including tropical environments, mountainous environments, karsts, snowy mountain peaks even. So what do they do when they get here? But also, how do humans impact their environment? So once humans make it here and settle in, what exactly do they do? And how does it affect the environment? And what are the signs of that effect on the environment? Also interested in chronology. So when do the first people get to this region, and when do our ancestors first get to this region? And looking at complex interactions of different people coming in and then going back out, and you have a lot of really interesting population movements throughout prehistory, since when the first people and their ancestors arrived. Part of the AC project, we have two research cores, the first being in the Raja Ampat Archipelago, Indonesia, which we'll focus on more specifically today, but also the Phung Quyen Hoa Binh Province, Vietnam, which is a rock shelter that discuss a little bit about. Southeast Asia, a little bit of archaeology. Let's set the stage here for what we'll be talking about today. Southeast Asia has popped up in news in archaeology and anthropological research pretty steadily for the past nearly 20 years or so. But it really kicked off with the discovery of Homo floresiensis, otherwise known as the Hobbit, and from the island of Flores in Indonesia. And this diminutive little creature kind of reignited tremendous interest in Southeast Asia for archaeologists and anthropologists and the wider public. Since then, we've discovered that multiple species lived in Southeast Asia for the past, at least 1 million years or so, maybe longer. Homo sapiens, our species, Homo erectus, Homo luzonensis, the Denisovans, and possibly others were living throughout the islands and the mainland for quite some time. We also have the earliest rock art in the world discovered, published this past summer from Sulawesi in Indonesia, 51,000 years ago. We have also the earliest evidence for a successful surgery at 31,000 years ago, the earliest deep sea fishing at 42,000 years ago, and the earliest dated plant artifact found outside of Africa, the continent of Africa, at about 55,000 years ago. And before we proceed to our next slide, I will advise that there are some photos of human remains, their bones. So if anyone's sensitive, just to flag that here. So I'll proceed now. And as you can see here, we have the earliest amputation, successful amputation, which requires pretty intricate knowledge of anatomy, but also different plants and herbs that might have been used as sanitizing elements for this kind of procedure. There's Homo floresiensis. If you haven't been down to the Smithsonian, you can go see that little sculpture anytime you like, as long as the museum's open. But that's a reconstruction of what the Hobbit might have looked like. So we have the earliest fish hooks from Timor, which is kind of in that Indonesian archipelago, that region. The earliest rock art, which we think depicts hunting scenes and a large pig-like creature, and then Denisovan tooth, which hit headlines, I think, maybe this past summer or so from the Cobra Cave, Tam Guhao in Laos. So these discoveries are coming out pretty much constantly throughout the year, and it's really ignited a lot of interest in the anthropology of this region. So why don't we situate ourselves geographically? I've highlighted for you here on a map what we think of as Southeast Asia, but I'd like for you to consider that in the past, these geopolitical boundaries probably didn't exist in the same way they do today, and much of southern China, Taiwan, Hainan Island, the rest of New Guinea, and parts of what we think of today as South Asia probably had more alike with Southeast Asia than they do today. So a little bit more about Southeast Asia, climate change particularly. Southeast Asia today, the geography makes it particularly vulnerable to climate change, partially due to low-lying coastlines. So relatively small increments of sea level change can swamp vast areas of land, as well as other threats related to climate change, including sea level rise and groundwater extraction in Jakarta. So this combination of seas rising and groundwater being extracted for fresh water has created a condition where the entire city is sinking into the sea. And it's gotten to the point where Jakarta has scheduled for, or sorry, Indonesia has scheduled for their capital to be moved from Jakarta to Indonesian Borneo. So, this climate change and its effects are happening as we speak today, particularly in this region. Other threats include destabilized monsoon season. This past monsoon season, Typhoon Yagi inflicted billions of dollars of damage in Southeast Asia, and the destabilized lives of millions of people, including 6 million children, were affected by this, whether by being dislocated to different areas or having their lives interrupted. So school closings, provinces closing, having to relocate to a different area. So, it's not often that you hear news about this in Western media, but these things are happening at an increasing rate, and one that's quite alarming to a lot of people. Now, with the urbanization and development of a lot of these countries, you see accompanying biodiversity loss. So as cities expand, the suburban regions extend into jungle or other environments, you see, the things living there can't live there anymore. And kind of this walks hand in hand with new or novel disease distributions. I think we all remember a little less than 5 years ago or so now, the pandemic that started in southern China, and we think a lot of these sort of incidents might occur at increasing rates due to people coming in contact with these animals that really haven't been in contact with humans for at that level for a long period of time. And as people go into the jungle, harvest more resources, bring it to more people, you're going to start to see other instances of zoonotic shift of disease from animals to people. Now, a lot of the changes today that I've highlighted are driven primarily by anthropogenic global warming. by a release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and the heating of the planet. But some of the phenomena we're looking at there, particularly, particularly changing coastlines, were mirrored in the past. Something to consider is that during the Ice Age, the sea was about 130 meters lower than it is today, and it rose to present day levels over the past 20,000 years. And we also know that associated with this shift, um, the monsoon season was destabilized. So as the world gradually became warmer, and the ice sheets melted, you see corresponding shifts in the monsoon season from archaeological paleoenvironmental reconstructions from cave sediments. So some of the issues that we are facing today, um, our ancestors living 20,000 years ago in Southeast Asia were beginning to face similar conditions. So this is Southeast Asia today. You might be familiar with this map. You can see Vietnam, Indonesia, but why don't we go into the past a bit? This is 50 meters below sea level. So you can see a lot of that island and the mainland are connected by land. So at one point, this continental shelf was basically a giant, um, just one massive landmass. And if we go back even further to 75 meters below present day levels, 100 meters below present day levels, and finally what the sea might have looked like at the last glacial maximum at the end of the last ice age. So again, if we why don't we go back and look at that transformation to what the sea looks like today, you see a tremendous amount of land being concealed by water. And one of the questions that we ask are, what did the humans living, because we know humans were here at this time, what did they do in response to this dramatic geographical and ecological change? So why don't I just talk a little bit about my research in Vietnam that I did for my PhD. Um, so my PhD research was focused at the Chang'an UNESCO World Heritage Site in the Ninh Bình province in the southwestern Red River Delta, the Song Hong of Vietnam, where my research looked at stone tool assemblages from 6 archaeological cave and rock shelter sites that were radiocarbon dated to between the 45,000 years ago to about 6,000 years ago. That's the period of time that my PhD covered. But I want to highlight that people still live there today. This land has been occupied for at least 45,000 years. And while the kinds of people, the types of people, the societies living here did change, people have been cultivating this landscape for quite a long period of time. One of the most exciting things we found were some human remains. We're in the process of trying to get these published, but these human remains would be the earliest human remains from, or relatively complete set of human remains from mainland Southeast Asia. Part of my PhD project was the geochemical sourcing of stone tools. So as part of when I was looking through these assemblages for my thesis, I started noticing that a lot of the stone tools were made out of volcanic, out of igneous stone. And what's interesting is that there really isn't much igneous stone in Chang'an because it's a karstic landscape, mostly dominated by limestone. So one of the questions we had is where this came from. And as part of my research, I used a geochemical sourcing technique to look at the chemical fingerprint of some of these stone tools and match that with potential sources in the broader landscape, and helped establish that these people, the hunter-gatherers living throughout the complex, were traveling anywhere between 30 and 80 kilometers, or yeah, 30 and 80 miles. I get my kilometers and miles mixed up sometimes, away from the core zone. So helping to establish a baseline range, a foraging range for the people who are living there. We also identified a few new deer species that were not known to have lived in this region during the Pleistocene. So helping to extend the range, refine our understanding of biogeography in this part of the world. And there are, but something I'm particularly proud of is that there are conservation elements of this project. So part of the project involved looking at how landscape changes over time through the lens of plants. So you can look through history and look for elements of seeds and wood and all this kind of thing and how that changes. Part of that involved a present day botanical survey throughout the landscape. And we found that it was a perfect habitat to release Trachypithecus delacouri, or the Delacour's langur, which is an IUCN Red List endangered species. So they released these langurs, sorry, into the environment, and last I heard, they had recently given birth to a few baby langurs. So looking at a really interesting intersection of archaeology and modern day conservation efforts. And today, so I guess moving forward with research in Vietnam, collaborating with members of the Vietnam Institute of Archaeology, Nguyen Thi Mai Hung and Nguyen Trung Dong, um, as well as Japanese colleagues, including Sawada Junmei, on analysis of stone tools from the Phung Khien rock shelter in Hua Bin, which is further inland. So it gives a nice little bit of point of comparison if we're interested in looking at what people are doing at different parts of the landscape over this period of time as well. So moving further east, all the way east to island Southeast Asia, where I think I alluded to the transformation of Sundaland, that massive land shelf, into present day conditions, otherwise referred to as island Southeast Asia. Looking at human environment relations across biogeographic boundaries, the archaeology of island settlement, and population movements throughout island Southeast Asia, as well as tropical environments and forager societies, particularly focused on islands. So these little tropical islands, we know people live there for long periods of time. And how do they interact? How do they get there? How do they interact with these environments? These are kind of the core questions of the research program in Indonesia. So my research takes place in Raja Ampat, which is Bahasa Indonesia for the Four Kings. And that's because there are four main islands, Waigeo, Batanta, Salawati, and Misul, and they're surrounded by thousands of smaller satellite islands. Raja Ampat, it lies at the heart of what is referred to as the Coral Triangle, primarily because there's an incredible degree of marine biodiversity. Over 3/4 of the world's known coral species called Raja Ampat and the Coral Triangle home. Recent studies also indicate that these corals and the communities associated with them are extraordinarily adaptable to global warming. So this kind of serves as a model, an ecological model of what seas might look like going forward. And looking at these corals and how they adapt to higher temperatures, hotter temperatures, and increased carbon dioxide in the sea, kind of might give us insight into how we might preserve coral societies, coral reefs in other parts of the world. Now, from the anthropology side of things, Raja Ampat and much of Southeast Asia and Eastern Asia has a general perception of stasis in the literature, basically saying that, well, the archaeology doesn't change that much over long periods of time. Therefore, the people must not have changed that much. They must have remained relatively unchanging, conservative, or a less charitable term I've heard of is stagnant. So these people kind of did the same thing since they got there, which, as I hope to point out today, is definitely not the case. So Raja Ampat sits at a number of different crossroads. Namely, here we're looking at geological crossroads. We have right here the confluence of different geological plates, tectonic plates: the Pacific Plate, the Philippines Plate, the Eurasian, and the Australian Plate. So along the Ring of Fire, there's a lot of igneous volcanic activity. But yeah, so that's one sense of crossroads, but also a biological crossroads. Here we have situated between Sundaland, Southeast Asia, and Sahul, or New Guinea and Australia, you have these three different biogeographic lines. And for those of us who aren't familiar with that term, plant and animal communities in between these lines, in between the Wallace line, the Weber line, and the Lydecker line, are markedly different. So this is a really interesting artifact of when the seas rose and began to isolate these communities from each other, and they began to take on different characters. So a biological and ecological crossroads as well. And also looking, taking a broader view, I've highlighted with this incredible orange or yellow arrow where we were, but human settlement of Raja Ampat kind of foreshadows larger human movements into the Polynesian Triangle, into the Pacific, which covers a third of the world's surface. So, looking at how people got to Raja Ampat on boats and how they began to familiarize themselves with these marine tropical communities is really key to understanding how humans eventually managed to settle the entire Polynesian Triangle in the perhaps a few thousand years, which in my opinion is probably the most incredible uh, example of human ingenuity, human creativity in the history of our species. So why don't we get into Raja Ampat? Here we have ourselves a map of the islands. As you can see, we lie right off um, New Guinea, right off the Bird's Head Peninsula. And the four islands I've highlighted: Waigeo, Batanta, Salawati, and Misol. These are the four kings. Today we'll be looking at Waigeo, the northernmost island, if you can see that. And you can see that great bay in the middle. So Waigeo is, um, yeah, it looks kind of like an eye. So you have this kind of oval shape, and then the bay in the middle, which is a really interesting ecosystem because you're surrounded by sea, but this bay takes a very different character than the ecosystems in the Pacific. So the Raja Ampat Project has the broad goal of unlocking the human past at the gateway between Asia and the Pacific. We're funded primarily by the National Geographic Society, but we also have support from other funding bodies, including the Leakey Foundation, Winnick Grand Society, as well as the National Museum of Natural History. So kind of the key questions, the core questions that we're asking here are: when did humans first arrive at Raja Ampat? Human ecology, past and present, refers to these ideas about how are humans adapting to these environments, and also how are humans shaping these environments. This kind of dance between humans and the place they live in over time in different spaces. Human culture, past and present. So who's coming here, and who else is coming here, and what do they do? How do they interact? A key question as well. Also, our project is really interested in terrestrial and marine ecology. While a lot is known about the coral reefs, there's still a lot to do uh, i- i- looking at the ecology of those environments, but also terrestrial. Not a lot is known about the types of plants and animals that live inside the forested interiors of the islands throughout the archipelago. So, as part of our project, we're working with ecologists to get a grasp of what's going on today, and also the possible futures of the archipelago. So one of the reasons that we study archaeology is to look at these broad shifts in human behavior and the place they live over great long periods of time. And if we're interested in looking at humans and what will happen to this planet over the next 50, 100, maybe even 1,000 years, I think taking a broader perspective, a long durée perspective, is key. Archaeology and anthropology are two social sciences that really incorporate human behavior and subsistence on that scale, and offer explicit frameworks with which to work to that end. And I'd also like to underscore here that this research is deeply, deeply collaborative. Gone are the days of the so-called helicopter archaeologists who will come in a parachute, um, dig in the jungle for a little bit, and then go back up to the helicopter and fly away. No, we work with these communities very deeply. We're very interested um, in supporting communities and what they want to know, um, and but also on a more practical level, offering them jobs, offering them trainings on technologies that we use, including flying drones, taking survey of archaeological sites. So we're really um, invested, I think is the best word to use, with the people who live there today, and we do our best to do right by these communities, without whom we wouldn't be able to work here at all. So here I'd like to point out some of the different proposed routes. Joseph Birdsell was a very influential archaeologist of Southeast Asia and proposed two broad potential migration patterns um, for the initial settlement of this region, but more broadly Australia. And here we have the northern route and the southern route. And you can see the northern route leads us directly. I should have put my giant yellow arrow here, but Route 1A leads us directly to the island Waigeo, where we were looking at what we were looking at before. So one of these models of human settlement of the region kind of puts us right where we're working. And we're beginning to test these models of island settlement and refining bird cells proposed settlement routes. So here I'd like to highlight some of the research done by my colleagues and collaborators. This is Dr. Annette Erdl at the University of Vienna, who is a biomolecular archaeologist employing zooms, or zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry, to open a new window into the archaeological record that we haven't had that's been relatively recent. So a lot of the archaeological bone that we have has been bashed to bits, to put it technically. Yeah, these bones that they've basically been hammered, and we think that that's part of the depositional process. So you throw something away, it falls apart. But also people were probably bashing bone to access marrow inside. So regardless of how it got mashed, it's been battered. So what zooms allows us to do is to take these little fragmented pieces of bone without it, and you can't really tell what kind of bone it is because it's been smashed so much. But by taking this bone and performing this chemical analysis called mass spectrometry on it, we can get protein fingerprints. And these protein fingerprints can tell us what kind of animal that bone came from. So it's opening up this new lens, really, this new incredible way of looking at all the types of animals that people were collecting. We don't know why they're collecting these animals, but we do know that they ended up in these people's kitchen garbage, to put it one way. Another one of my colleagues is Augustin Capriati from Wageningen University of Research in the Netherlands. Sorry, Augustin is a marine ecologist interested in the seas of Raja Ampat, what's happening there today. Some of the methods that Augustin uses include citizen science, which is basically going on Facebook groups and asking people to post pictures of fish they find. Questionnaires, so going to local folks and asking them what the seas look like, what their fishing looks like. Also asking elders, what kind of fish were you eating 20 years ago, 30 years ago, compared to what kind of fish you're eating today? What are the sizes of these fish? What are the characters of the seafoods that you're eating? And this will allow us to get some sort of resolution about how the seas are changing, how the communities, the reef communities around Raja Ampat are reacting to a series of global climatic and environmental changes. Finally, Augustin uses environmental DNA. So environmental DNA, you take a sample of water and basically you can run this through some sort of sequencer and it'll tell you what sort of species are present or absent, or yeah, what sort of species are present in a particular reef. You can also do this with sediment. So going down to the bottom, picking up sand or mud or what have you. So these combined approaches will give us a pretty good idea about what's going on with the marine ecology. So these are a few photos of some of Augustin's work. We have on the left here, we have the Mambrasar family, who we work with very closely. They're harvesting some shellfish. In the middle, we have Tridacna shells. Tridacna are giant clams, and we find these shells everywhere. They people like to eat them, but they also use them for other things. And finally, here we have recorded marine species. So when the fishermen will go out during the morning and come back with their catch, Augustin will ask to take a look at what they have and record the types of species that people are collecting. Admittedly, this is during one season, so we went during late summer, but we hope to get at different times of the year as well to get an idea of seasonality affects the types of species collected. Yeah. So moving on to terrestrial ecology. My colleagues Heron Yando, who just received his bachelor's degree in biology from the Universitas Cendrawasih, and Christoph Parsch from Göttingen University in Germany. Methods that they're taking include camera trapping. So for those of you who hunt will know what I'm talking about, but you put cameras up in the forest that are motion censored. So if something moves, it automatically takes a photo. This will give us a good idea of what is bumping around. And some of our cameras have infrared capability, so they can take photos at night and figure out what's going on at night in the jungle. citizen science. So again, taking that same approach that Augustine was taking of asking local folks of what animals are living here today, what animals were living in the past. And that kind of ties in with interviews with local elders, people who hold, I guess, social status in a lot of the villages, but people who are tasked with remembering about their local histories. Yeah, so here's a few photos of heron organizing some camera traps, and it's quite hard to see here, but there's a photo of a stick insect here. That heron is an entomologist who's particularly interested in the insect communities. Yeah, so another important part of ecology are plants. So this is led by Dr. Anna Florin, who is a lecturer at the Australian National University, who was also part of the team that excavated the earliest dated site in Australia, Majid Baby, in yeah, I forget which state it was, but yeah, the earliest archaeological site in Australia. And as part of our project, we employ wet sieving, which is you take archaeological sediment and then basically sieve it using water, hence the name wet sieving. And this allows us to isolate small botanical fragments, meaning seeds, um, little bits of organic matter that otherwise would probably be discarded. We also have a sediment sample collection, including, well, basically you have archaeological sediment and you dig it out in buckets in different archaeological layers. So you'll take sediment from that layer, and um, looking through that sediment allows us to look for smaller elements of plants, like plant silicates. So plants use silicates for structure and for defense, and they vary by different species and genus. So by getting character of these microscopic little um, silicates, you can get an idea of what kind of plants are in the area, or at least in that archaeological layer. These things are tiny and it's painstaking work, but it's a really important lens into the kinds of plant communities that people were interacting with over archaeological occupations. Also interested in ethnobotany. So what are people, how are people interacting with plant communities today? And that involves a lot of asking local people what they do with plants. Horticulture. Can you hear me?
I can hear you again now. There was a glitch for a minute there, but
Yeah, my headset turned itself off
oh,
when no sound comes through. So yeah, if that happens again, we'll just
let's
reset it.
roll with it.
Anyways, yeah,
Yeah.
great. Yeah, so again, asking local people what they're doing with plants and what kind of plants they're eating or using for um, uh, uh, like medicines or even ornaments, this kind of thing. So really, what do people do with the forests around them? And part of this project involves creating a reference collection of local plants for a local university. So these are quite important for future research in this region. And to kind of illustrate some of the things I was talking about here, we have some collections research at BRIN is Badan Riset dan Inovasi Nasional, which is the Indonesian Science Foundation. So we're working with our Indonesian colleagues, looking at some specimens that were collected maybe a few hundred years ago from Raja Ampat. Here we have sago processing, and sago is a palm type of palm that the people use for carbohydrates. So basically, they grow these trees, cut them in half, scrape out the innards. You can ferment it, or you don't have to ferment it, and then pound it into starch or flour. And you can make a number of different things from this, including papeda, which is this gooey stuff you see in the upper right corner. Um, Papeda is one of the key foods in Raja Ampat and in New Guinea, down in the coast. Um, we tried some, and it tastes a lot like wood, and I it kind of like that tastes like licking a two by four. It's very woody. You can really taste it.
Really
It's not
selling
bad.
the national cuisine.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's not bad. It's just a unique flavor that not many people, I think, over here would be familiar with. It was, I think, relatively pleasant, but regardless, they eat it with a lot of other stuff. So fish, the traditional meal would be a papeda with a fried fish and some turmeric, lime, chili sauce. Pretty good, but very filling, very filling. Here we have wet sieving. So we have archaeological sediment that's being screened through that mesh there. And yeah, we take whatever's left on that mesh, bag it up, and Anna can take a look at the smaller botanicals and organics in a lab. And there's another photo of wet sieving here. And here I have a short video, if it will play. Yeah, so this is sago processing. And this stuff that Mama Membrasar is kneading is that pulp from the inside of that tree. So right now she's kneading it to release all this water. And after the pulp has been suitably processed, it's dried or fermented. And then with that, you have flour. So Raja Ampat Project, talk a little bit about the archaeological excavations in 2023. So they were excavating at a place called Malolo, which in the local language means the place where the currents come together. And archaeological dating of a plant artifact indicated that this site was at least 55,000 years old. Now, what's interesting here too is that we have archaeological evidence below that artifact hearths. We have hearth features. So we're working with some of our Australian and Indonesian colleagues to hopefully get these layers dated via optically stimulated luminescence, which is a method for older dates that radiocarbon dating can't quite reach. We also have, again, so that little plant artifact I was referring to is called damar. People still use it today. It's a little stick of tree resin that you'll carry around with you. And if you need to glue something together or start a fire, you can use this damar, basically a portable glue stick / matchbox. Yeah, pretty useful stuff. Now, from the animals, the types of bones we have, we were able to figure out that people were processing land and sea animals. So we have large bats, pheasants, mid-sized marsupials, and rats, but also sea urchin spines and teeth from fast-swimming carnivorous fish. So this shows a pretty deep understanding of tropical environments. So how these people were collecting bats and pheasants remains unknown, but they were able to go out into deep water and also collect carnivorous fish. So again, that really good understanding of local ecology for their subsistence. And also possibly these people were moving different animals across. I discussed briefly earlier the biogeographic lines. So we think people were probably moving animals across those lines, which would be a pretty interesting instance of, I guess, humans beginning already to shape biogeography 55,000 years ago. Yeah, so one of these interesting things. And here's a picture of this damar. So on the left, we have the artifact that was excavated, dated to 55,000 years ago. And on the right, we have some using it today. So to see that artifact and how it was used, or obvious human use by the snap patterns and the striations on that artifact, we know a human made it 55,000 years ago. But to see people still using it in the archipelago today is really quite interesting. Here's some other artifacts we found. Found this teeth from a large fish. I think it's either a tuna or barracuda. We're thinking more likely to be barracuda, but still trying to figure that out. Here we have some bone tools, as well as sea urchin tool. So sea urchin spines would have been used as maybe needles or also points for projectiles, some sort of weaponry, or even arrows. So why don't we talk a little bit about the ethnography here in Raja Ampat. So human culture, looking at what people are doing today. Looking at pottery making, past and present. Slide to talk about that. Plant processing, what people are doing with plants. Hunting practices, so what people go into the forest and still hunt. And this is a really good way for us to learn about what kind of animals are living there by talking to local hunters. Interested in local languages. People here speak Ambel, which is a Maya language. A little bit about making canoes, opinions about different types. And yeah, this is particularly interesting because talking in the archipelago today, people primarily use these fiberglass canoes. What's interesting is that the older folks, elders, do not like these canoes at all. They hate them. If we're riding with them through the Pacific, you can see them gripping very firmly onto the sides of these canoes. And it's because if you hit something going at velocity in one of these canoes, the canoe will shatter. Now, granted, you can go a lot faster, but there is very little durability. Um, what the elders prefer are wood canoes. And yeah, they're a lot slower, but if you also hit like a coral mound that you didn't know was there, your boat isn't going to shatter. So just some different perceptions about novel technologies being brought into the region. And also a resource management system called SASE. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few slides. But here we have pottery. So this forno oven is something that is used for baking sago, baking those little that tree flour into bread. And we have archaeological forno that dates maybe a few hundred years, but also forno that we found during archaeological survey. But we also went to a pottery village and learned how it's made today. So interesting to look at the geochemical composition of these different potteries to figure out where people are getting the natural resources, the clay to make these, and where that clay is going subsequently. So looking at exchange of goods throughout the archipelago. Um, Forno is unfortunately a dying practice. One of the pottery villages, Kabalal, is one of the last places in Raja Ampat to make Forno. The people who make it, the artisans, are uh, all women, most of whom are all of whom are over 50 years old or so, and they have, from what they tell us, there's really no interest among the younger generation in learning how to make this. So we're documenting the process, really, in case at some point further down the road the people are interested in learning how their ancestors made this particular type of oven. So this is one example of our ethnography. Here we have making a wooden canoe. Again, this is how they make the traditional canoes. It's a lot more time consuming, and they're not as fast, but they still make them because they feel much safer in these canoes. Here we have a bird trap. So you have this little coconut shell, and you can see there's little bits of fishing wire attached to that rod extending from the coconut shell. So they'll load that coconut shell with bait, seeds or something along those lines, and little birds will come along and get their feet stuck in the fishing twine. So that's one of the traps these people set for the birds. And finally, Sasi Kalapa. So Sasi means taboo in the local language. Kalapa means coconut. So what the Sasi system is a system of resource management where you have an authority, usually a village elders or a church, will set aside different parcels of land or sea to let the spirits rejuvenate. So, whether this is a few months or 6 months or so, um, they set this area aside and say, if anyone collects coconuts here or fishes here or hunts here, evil spirits will ruin your life, basically. Uh, so this is particularly interesting because this tradition is not local to the region. We think it was adopted maybe 100, 200, 300 years ago from the West, from the Molucca, the Spice Islands. Now, why this is important is that we're looking at an organically adopted um, system of resource management under systems of colonial oppression by the Dutch, the English, and so on and so forth. So looking at how resource management, which by the way has been scientifically, empirically demonstrated to increase the productivity over long periods of time of these coconut groves and reefs. So looking at how this type of system was implemented organically with buy-in from local communities is kind of critical if we're looking at resource conservation today. So it's one of these really interesting things that we're looking at. Also, archaeologically, what are the archaeological residues of Sasi, and can we begin to look at when this project, this system was first implemented, and look at it over time and identify how Sasi affected the types of resources that people were consuming. This is next slide discusses a bit about interviews with hunters and one of the more fruitful conversations we had. So on the left you have this thing is called a I forget what it's called. It's a tree marsupial that lives in the tree, and on the left you have this the tree one, and on the right you have the ground one. The tree one only lives in the trees, and we knew that this lived, the Sanamba in the local language, only live in the trees, and it lives on Waigeo. We had known that it lives in Waigeo, but we're talking with Cuscus, Cuscus. That's the name of this thing, Cuscus. Sorry. Now, the ground couscous, we did not know lived in this area, but talking with local hunters, showing them pictures, they would say, "Oh yeah, we see this all the time. It's very easy to catch because it only walks on the ground." Which is, yeah, this is exactly right. But this had here was unknown to exist in this on this island. So by discussions with local people about what they eat, what they hunt, we're able to extend the biogeographic range of the species, which is pretty interesting. Um, yeah, so again, it shows the importance of asking the people who have lived there and whose ancestors lived there for 55,000 years. Probably a pretty good idea of the kinds of animals that are bumping around their villages. So a little bit about the archaeological research in 2024, this past summer, for about 2 months. Yeah, about 2 months. I was there 6 weeks. Included excavations at a cave site near Warsaman village, an excavation at a rock shelter, more in the inland, the forested interior, excavation of a cave site near a village called Kalitoko, a potential Lapitoid site near Kabadiri village. Lapita talks about some of the Austronesian expansions. So we're looking at much later in time than the Pleistocene, but still really interesting phenomena here. Some of those people who would potentially be the ancestors of the folks who colonized the entire Pacific Ocean. And then archaeological survey of the north coast of Waigeo Island. So to put these on the map here, there are the four villages that we're really focusing in, and then the North Coast survey. So that the red lines show you the extent to which uh, we were looking, and we would go along to beaches along that north coast, put in test pits, so small shovel pits at different points along the beach, but also further inland to look for evidence of archaeology. Now, this survey was very interesting, but very unproductive in the sense that we didn't really find much in terms of archaeology. Now, what we think is that this was probably a pretty bad place to settle during the Pleistocene, and discussions with the village elders kind of confirmed that, because you are situated right on the facing the Pacific Ocean. So we're there during a fairly calm time of year. The ocean is very uh, you know, very flat, not many waves, not many storms. But at other periods of the year, it gets really quite nasty up there, windy and choppy and waves that are relatively large. So we think when people were settling villages and looking for places to um, uh, use as home bases, they were probably looking at areas along that interior, along that bay. And indeed, the archaeological site with the oldest dates is the one near Warsaman village down there at the mouth of the bay. So we're thinking, yeah, maybe we'll refocus our efforts looking for archaeological sites along the coast, along the shores of that bay. Here is a cave site near Warsaman, and here again, this gadget that our colleagues are working with is called a total station. So you can basically point it at a point and it will record that point in digital space. So if we activate artifacts, you can take multiple readings and essentially reconstruct an entire archaeological site digitally. So if we're interested in looking at the spatial distribution of different artifacts, different types of artifacts, then this machine will really allow us to do that. This is excavations at a cave site near Kalitoko. What's really interesting is one of our colleagues took one step inside this cave and said that we're not going to find anything because evidently it was really kind of gross, very damp, moist, a lot of bugs, um, really smelly from the amount of bats that were living in that cave. And she was right. They actually didn't really find much of anything at all. But they did go out on survey throughout some of that interior and found some potentially other productive archaeological sites. Here we have excavation that I was co-leading at the Cockheat Rock Shelter at Waigeo, inland, but still relatively close to the ocean. Really interesting site. And here I have a little bit of video. There's one of our undergraduates down there digging away with one of our Papuan colleagues, and Dylan Gaffney, Dr. Gaffney, who is co-director of the project and an associate professor over at Oxford University. This giant pile of dirt in the lower left corner is what we call the spoils heap. So you'll see the little structure above it is a sieve. So we'll pour dirt on that, kind of sieve through it, and then pick out archaeologically significant things, and then the other sediment is there. So we use that to put back in the trench when we're done with it. It's very important to do that because if people are walking through there or something's walking through, we don't want them to fall in and get hurt. So it'd be quite bad to do that. Here we have rock art. Maybe it's a little difficult to see, but you can see the outline of a hand as well as potentially some sort of figure with a tail. Perhaps it's kind of hard to tell, but he's holding up two clubs. And part of our research was looking at rock art and identifying new rock art uh, sites throughout the archipelago. Here's some survey. So what's really interesting is that during World War II, the Japanese used Raja Ampat as a base, and we found a Japanese machine gunner's nest at the mouth of the bay at one of these sites. This is a cave that we think that by legend has the Japanese used as a hideout. And one morning we were, taking our morning coffee, and one of the village elders just walks up to us and has a katana in his hand and says, "Oh yeah, we found this in the jungle. My father found this in the jungle a little while ago, like I don't know, decades ago." But it's interesting to see kind of those archaeological residues of World War II, something that we're looking way back in the past, but this is much more recent, but still incredibly exciting when we find anything from that time period. And here's some a photo of beach survey. So further inland, you'll see those trees, those tall ones with the fronds are coconut trees. A lot of people will have their own little coconut grove. So they'll have a garden that they don't really they don't live there, but they just go to it when they want to. But this gives us good opportunity because they've already tilled the soil, uplifted the soil. So by looking through these gardens, you can find little bits of pottery or little bits of archaeological bone or what have you, and that kind of gives us a hint as to if we should put in a shell pit or not. And we did go in a lot of these gardens with people's permission and with locals with us, so we weren't just digging up people's front yards. But it was gardens and this kind of thing are always really important sources of archaeological material if you have the opportunity. Now, this photo here is one of an inland coral terrace, which is really interesting because it's a lot further inland than the current modeling would suggest. So we think maybe the sea was even a bit higher than what we thought it was before, or some sort of uplift is happening with the island. Regardless, we kind of need to take a close look at some of those models of sea level and uh, uh, geologic action at Raja Ampat. A little bit about our collections research. We're currently storing our project materials at a national archaeological office in Jayapura. It's become a bit more complex because the government is trying to move all archaeological material to Jakarta, which is on the other side of the country, and which we are really not happy to do because of a number of reasons, but largely we think that logistically it's better to have Papua material in near Papua. Yeah, so we're working on a memorandum of understanding between the University of Oxford and the project and the local museum to hopefully have some of the materials stored at a local place, local university museum. Now, what you have here is a pottery assemblage from Raja Ampat that was excavated by sorry, that's a type of Wilhelm Solheim, who was a really influential archaeologist based out of University of Hawaii at Manoa. And this pottery is interesting. It's kind of difficult to tell from the picture, but this pottery is quite thin. And some of the older pottery is really thin, whereas the newer pottery is a bit thicker. So we're hopefully going to go back sometime over the next year, a few years, take a look at this pottery. We are working with a museum curator who's more than happy for us to take a look at this stuff and potentially get an idea of some of the earliest pottery in the region. So moving forward, what are we gonna do? Well, lithic analysis. Potentially, if there are any lithics that can be geochemically sourced, we'd like to get an idea of what kind of raw materials that people are using here. Also use use wear and residue analysis. Combined, we call this traceology. So if you have a stone tool and you're using it for cutting bamboo, it'll leave a certain character, a certain signature on that edge. If you're cutting bone or wood, it leaves other signatures. So by looking at the different signatures, the use wear signatures on stone tools, we might get an insight into how people were using different raw materials or how they were using their stone tools. zooarchaeology. We're interested in starting a fish otolith reference collection. So otoliths are little ear bones of these fish, and they're quite small, but they vary tremendously in shape and size between different species. So one of these bones that preserve very well because they're very dense, very small, very hard, um, but they're difficult to find. So working with one of the curators at the National Museum of Natural History down in Fishes has agreed to kind of help provide provide some help in starting this collection. Also, paleoenvironmental reconstruction. You have Anna with her work with the plants, and Annette and Dylan with their work with the bones. We're going to start to get a picture from different archaeological sites of how these plant and animal communities are changing over time from 55,000 years ago up to the present. And one particularly interesting analysis from the zooarchaeological side of things is the pig bone, so suids, pigs. And we have a lot of pig bone from period of about 2,000 years up to the present. But by looking at the DNA of that bone and the DNA of modern pig bone, which we obtained from some hunters, we can get an idea of the um, when pigs first got there and what those communities look like over the 2,000 years since they've been in the island. Today they're feral, so they just run through the forest. Um, but who knows what that was like in the past. So moving forward, future visits that we have planned. We have some visits to Jaipura potentially in April, um, as well as to Yogyakarta which is on Java for work with our colleagues. Then hopefully at some point I'll getting over to Oxford to look at some of the lithics with my project collaborator. Hopefully a conference in Jaipura or Sorong over in on New Guinea, and a field season this summer, likely sometime between July and August, and looking at sites that we know of on Waigeo, but potentially looking at Misol Island at some point. This is still very early and require us to have some discussions with the National Archaeological Research Group, not National Science Group, but it's something that we might be interested in. And so with that, I'd really like to thank you for coming, for taking time out of your day or evening, and I'd like to welcome any questions that you might have.
There's a question in the chat, Ben, from Richard. Remind me again of what Homo species you found, how old, etc.
So the one that we found, oh yeah, so from Vietnam, it would be a Homo sapiens. So uh, just like you or me, somewhere between 12 to 13,000 years old. And this is not the oldest human fossil we have. That's from Tom Putling in Laos, which is earlier than about 50 to 60, maybe even older. The dating of that site is constantly revised, but that's the oldest one. But the one that we have has a relatively complete skull and postcrania, so other bones that allow us to reconstruct like height. Um, and we even have some genetics from that. So, hopefully that'll be published shortly. Um, and keep your eyes out for that. Yeah.
So I'm feeling like there's a sense of urgency here. I mean, you're talking about not only the threat of climate change, but political instability. And then you were specifically talking about that method of making pottery that younger people don't have any interest in, and you're trying to preserve that.
Mhm.
Is there like a race against time in a sense to kind of like preserve and find the artifacts before they're gone? Or is that
I
an,
think there's a lot of well, first of all, this area is historically been an area of considerable political sensitivity. I won't get too much into it, but if you're interested in the history of New Guinea, there are a lot of resources online to take a look at what's been happening there over the past 50 to 100 years, and even further beyond that. Climate change does pose significant issues where we are for the archaeology. A lot of the sites are coastal, so as sea rises, a lot of these sites will be lost forever. So, getting in there, looking at what's going on is really key. Um, I think science of this area, beyond the archaeology, is is really quite crucial because again, Southeast Asia is one of the I don't want to say canary in the coal mine, but it's one of those areas of the world that is being already significantly affected by global warming, global heating. Um, And by understanding what that looks like at this area that is kind of turned the dial of 10 on everything from the disease to the rising sea level to the groundwater sinking. Um, well, it's kind of crucial to get an idea of what's our world is going to look like within the next 20 to 30, 40 years. I mean, you're already seeing this in New York. New York, Long Island is sinking itself. Large areas of Florida facing coastal erosion. So by looking at this area, figuring out what we can learn, but also how we can help these communities, looking at the kind of animals that live there and how people are interacting with the animals and how to, maybe figure out how their subsistences will be affected, looking at ecological forecasting. Is kind of something that we're interested in doing, and kind of in any way that our project can be of any use in trying to make folks' lives a little bit easier down that part of the world. We will do our best.
And that leads me into one of the questions in the chat from Jackie. How does one get to volunteer on this project?
It's a really good question. Yeah, mostly we take students with us. We take undergraduate and graduate students with us, and we take local workers. I'll tell you what, the permitting situation makes it such that volunteering in Indonesia is essentially impossible, because it's quite a complex process, and they kind of vet everyone who goes into the country, and they vet every single person, and they have to write up these statements about their own research and all this kind of thing. It's a bureaucratic nightmare. But yeah, good question.
So a couple of other questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Richard is asking, since so much land is covered by water, is it practical to do any archaeology underwater? And there was also a question from Patricia about terminology. By plant artifact, do you mean a plant remnant that shows signs of human interaction?
So the first one, underwater archaeology, is an excellent question, and the Indonesian archaeological, um, uh, the national authority does a lot of underwater archaeology. The issue is that you have a lot of underwater movement and sediments and all this kind of stuff, so it makes the stuff that we're looking at, which is tens of thousands of years old, a lot more difficult. Incredibly difficult. Now, if you're like, there are a lot of shipwrecks and historical shipwrecks going back to the ancient Chinese, or not the ancient, the Chinese traders there and this kind of thing. But during the Pleistocene, it's a lot harder. You're also have other um, mitigating factors, like where we work, there are a lot of saltwater crocodiles, and those things you really don't want to mess with, and just these kind of things that you have to take into account. It's a very challenging, incredibly challenging, and doing the archaeology on land is difficult enough without having to worry about oxygen or something like that. Now, the second question, reference plant artifact, that's an excellent question. Now we know it's an artifact because it has a snap striations, and also the resin was formed in a way that it had to have been formed. So it couldn't have formed naturally. It was kind of formed into that little block. So it's not like just a piece of sap that someone found, rather something that they gathered the sap, heated it, made this little thing, and then snapped it off. And then you have striations from potential use and all this kind of stuff. So beyond the shadow of a doubt, we can say that this is intentionally made by a human. Yeah, very good question though. Yeah.
All right. Looks like the last of the questions. So I was kind of wondering about something that you mentioned a while back about evidence of animals being moved from place to place and across
Mhm.
islands and things like that. Are you talking about, like, is there evidence, or did you look for evidence of domestication that early on, or what?
Oh no, no, domestication doesn't really happen in this part of the world, really.
You did say something about pigs later, so then I was
Yeah,
wondering.
pigs. So those went feral, and it's really hard to say. Yeah, we have no evidence of any sort of domestication. If anything, people would maybe make pig traps, and we did kind of see this today. So basically, this like a garden that you put out, and then if a pig went in, they had it so like the gate would snap shut, or the pig would fall into something like that. Um, yeah, so we don't really have any evidence of that I'm aware of that domestication of animals. You do have horticulture, again, so leaving those coconut groves, leaving even their sago, they kind of leave those groves to grow and come back when the plants are ready, cut them down. Um, But these instances of potentially of people moving different animals across geographic lines would probably be just taking with them for food. Um, yeah, something along those lines. Or yeah, it's very difficult to say whether the animal was killed before or after, or at what point during that process. But yeah, people are doing interesting things very, very long ago. So yeah,
That's so interesting. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Benjamin Utting, everyone. Peter Buck, postdoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian Institution National Museum of Natural History in the Human Origins Program. We really appreciate it. It's super interesting. Everyone, come see our mammoth. You got like 2 weeks or something to come see our mammoth, and then it's gone. So I just had to put that in there again. Thanks, everyone. As a reminder, no art club in March. I'm going to be out of town, but we will be back in April, and I will email you all with an update about that. So thanks, everyone. Take care. See you soon.